In this video, we are going to be dealing with the elements of the paragraph argument. Now, let me preface this by saying that ETS, the people who write the GRE, don't actually have a specific section called the paragraph argument. They don't even call this type of question we have here the paragraph argument. Indeed, paragraph argument is simply subsumed or is part of the reading comprehension section. So ETS just considers this another reading comprehension question, but it is definitely not. So what is it then? Well, a paragraph argument is a paragraph, hence the name, and in that paragraph it's making an argument, and that part I highlighted in red there, or squigglied in red, is the paragraph argument. Now, each paragraph argument will be followed by a question. Which of the following, if true, weakens the argument above? So in this specific case, what I've done is I've dissected this paragraph. So you may want to take a quick second and just read this, be familiar with what it says, but I'm not necessarily going to spend the entire time reading that paragraph, because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dissect it, and I'm going to tell you what are the elements of these paragraph arguments. What are they made up of? They're made up of premises and the conclusion. Of course, your job is to find that conclusion. But first, let's start with the premises. What are premises? Well, premises are facts. And the facts in this paragraph are that over the last few years, Malanda has suffered a drought, and as a result has experienced major losses in crops. That is given as a fact in the paragraph. We have to assume that is true. What else is a fact? Since the drought began, the amount of Malanda imports has increased. Fact number 2. Now, the next part of the paragraph argument, some would say the most important part, is the conclusion. The conclusion is the tying together of facts. And it's not really that difficult to find it, because it usually, in fact, almost always comes at the end after the facts have been stated. So what's tricky about these isn't identifying the premise and identifying the conclusion, but it's identifying the gap. So you can see here's the conclusion stated. It's word for word. But the gap is something that the conclusion does not take into account. Moreover, it's something that's not even printed. It's this missing piece, and that's what makes it difficult to find. So, what is the gap? What are we talking about here? Well, X causes Y. That's what this stands for. You're going to wonder, wait, why is Chris doing algebra? But this isn't algebra, but this is formal logic. Something is causing something else to happen. In the prompt that we just went through, it assumes something. It assumes that the increase of imports is caused by the drought. So drought is X. And the drought causes the number of imports in Malandia to go up. That is the conclusion. So the drought has caused the imports to go up. Now, the gap is, well, wait a second. What if something else caused the imports to go up? What if there is another cause? And therefore, the argument makes this leap, and it's jumping over a chasm, and that's why I call it the gap. But there could definitely be something else. And that something else, we're going to jump through there, but that something else is called the Z. The Z is this other factor that we need to identify. Something else caused the increase in imports. What could it be? Well, this is one possibility. A quickly rising middle class has increased the demand for consumer electronics produced outside Malanda. What this means is that people are suddenly buying all these cool laptop computers from outside Malanda, and those computers are part of the imports, and so imports are going up because of that, not because of the drought. So Z is a possible answer or explanation that shows that the drought is not causing the imports to go up. Another possibility could be this one. Malanda's economic well-being rests on imports from many different countries, or rather different industries, not just crops. So we can see that, aha, it's importing all this other stuff not related to food and drought conditions. Now, the thing about these questions is they're not going to ask you, oh, can you please state what could be a possibility? That would be really hard to do. That's what the test writers do. They come up with these answers, but you have to be able to identify that Z. So what the actual question will look like is this. Aha, here it is. The paragraph argument in full. Now you'll notice that that's the exact same as the very first slide, but what every question comes with, of course, are the answer choices, A through E. Every paragraph argument will have A through E. Your job is to, of course, read this question, anticipate the gap, thinking, well, wait a second, they're assuming that the drought is causing the imports to increase. Maybe it's something else. That's all you really have to do once you've identified the gap. Then you read the question, which of the following, if true, weakens the argument above. And so now we want to identify, well, which one points to this Z? Let's read A. This is the first significant drought Malanda has had in the last 100 years. Does this relate to this gap in the argument about something else possibly causing the imports to go up? And the answer is no, it is irrelevant, so we get rid of it. B, Malanda's economic well-being rests on imports from many different industries, not just crops. And you're going to say, hey, we just saw that. That was the Z, and that's the answer. And yes, that is the answer. But make sure you understand the logic why that's the answer. Of course, that's the key to all of these paragraph argument questions. But let's just get rid of these other guys. The neighboring country of Zambia has witnessed a decrease in exports since the drought began. You're going to notice a lot of these are irrelevant. They want you to start thinking maybe, oh, imports and exports, maybe it is relevant. But you're comparing a different country. It has nothing to do with Malanda, so we get rid of C. D, the amount of imported food that the average Malandan consumes has increased since the beginning of the drought. So again, they bring in words from the prompt. That's what these tricky wrong answers do. You think, ooh, imported food, drought. But it's talking about what? It's saying, well, it's actually increased. It is bringing in more food. And you always want to remember, what's the question asking for? To weaken it. So we can get rid of D. E, the drought in Malanda is expected to intensify in the coming years. That doesn't really deal with imports at all, so we can get rid of E as well. Now, the key with these questions, of course, is really to pick up on the gap and to be able to read through these. What's going to change, though, is not the paragraph itself, but the questions. This weaken type of question is just one. And in the following videos, you're going to see other variants of questions that follow the paragraph.
In this video, you will learn about the weaken the conclusion question type. That is, there is a conclusion drawn in the argument, and you must find an answer choice that weakens that conclusion. Now, it's important to note that the word weaken will not always show up in the question itself. Sure, you may get which of the following, if true, most seriously or severely weakens the argument. But you may get other questions in which you have verbiage such as cast the most doubt or most seriously undermines. The point here is that you should quickly note that, oh, look, they're asking me to weaken the conclusion. Therefore, the strategies and techniques you learn in this video, you'll be able to apply to the question. Now, it's also important to note that these questions come after the paragraph. So you have a quick paragraph or prompt in which you have the premises and the conclusion, then you have this question, and then, of course, the answer choices. Okay, now that we know how to identify a weaken the conclusion or weaken the argument question type, let's talk about the basic approach. You should identify the premises or the facts in the paragraph. These usually come at the beginning in the first couple of sentences. Then you will have the conclusion. So it's usually easy to spot the conclusion, but be very careful when you're reading the conclusion to read each word. Then think to yourself, how do the premises and the conclusion connect? Because the premises are sort of like the legs of a table holding up the table, and the conclusion is the flat part, that table itself. When you see how they're connected, you should notice some gaps. In fact, the test writers write these questions so that there are these holes. And so you could think of these holes as glue. And the glue in the case of the table is not really there, and so the table can fall apart. Those are the assumptions, really. And that's why it's so important to think about the assumptions, the glue that holds the argument together. Because if you don't have these assumptions, or these assumptions are invalid, then the entire conclusion falls apart. What you should not do is immediately race down to the answer choices and try to find the correct answer. You should think of these unstated assumptions, and usually you'll just want to think of one general assumption, which is something that we'll do here in a minute with an actual practice question. And then, of course, go to the answer choices once you've thought about the paragraph at this level. First off, let's take a very sort of softball approach here by having something very simple. This is not, of course, on the level of an actual GRE paragraph argument question, but this will help us better understand what it is to weaken the conclusion. So here we have Mike. He's the state's #1 mathlete last year. That's the fact. That's a premise. he has been preparing for this year's Math Olympics by studying 2 hours a day. That is the other fact. Finally, there is the conclusion. Therefore, Mike will win the Math Olympics. That's the conclusion. That's the important part. So I'll put a little squiggly mark where that begins. Of course, this is usually pretty straightforward when there's only a few lines. It becomes a little bit more difficult when you have 7 or 8 lines. What is even trickier, of course, is identifying those unstated general assumptions. What unstated general assumption do we have here? Well, Mike won last year, and he's going to prepare for this year's Olympics, Math Olympics that is, by studying for 2 hours. What's the assumption? That 2 hours is enough preparation time to ensure that he'll be a repeat winner. So what if an answer choice is, because of increased competition, most top-ranked state mathletes have increased the number of hours they prepare. It's not exactly word for word what we have as an assumption, but it deals with the same issue, that the 2 hours that is mentioned in the argument itself is not enough for Mike to win again, and therefore the conclusion is weakened. The conclusion doesn't totally fall apart. It was only meant to cast some doubt. Let's take a look at another possible assumption. This one, of course, is a little bit more subtle, but the fact is that he was the state's #1 mathlete last year. Now he's going to the Math Olympics. Maybe the Math Olympics is a nationwide competition. The assumption, though, is that the Math Olympics is not a nationwide competition. That is simply a state competition, so Mike will win again. But if it turns out that the Math Olympics includes mathletes from all 50 states, well, suddenly it becomes far more competitive. And again, our faith in the conclusion is weakened. Mike could still win, but it's not as likely. And that's kind of the correct answer. What is not a correct answer is complete destruction of the conclusion. So you will never have an answer choice such as Mike caught pneumonia and will be bedridden during the competition. There's no way he can win. He's not even going to show up. Not the same as a weaken. That's basically you're destroying the conclusion completely, and that will never be one of the answer choices. But it's important to know that when you're looking for an answer choice, that you're looking for one that simply casts doubt on the conclusion. So let's take a look here at an actual question. This is a little bit tougher, but I want you to actually go through this on your own and even pause the video to do so. But before you do so, remember the basic approach. Read, looking for premises, spotting the conclusion, and then figure out how the premises connect to the conclusion and what that gap is, that jump from the premises to the conclusion. And if you can identify that gap, that's the major unstated assumption. So try to do that before rushing down to the answer choices. Once you've written down, and I'm encouraging you to write it down so you can compare what you have to what I have, then look for the correct answer. Okay, pause the video. Okay, I assume you paused the video. So what we're going to do is take away all those distracting answer choices for now and focus just on the premises, the conclusion, and the assumption. The premises here are that there's been a boll weevil infestation for the last 3 years, and it's problematic, so the farmers have started to use something called Eradicon. And the reason they're using this is it emits an odor that the boll weevil hates. So those are the facts. Now we're jumping right here to the conclusion. The Agricultural Board expects that cotton production on those farms using Eradicon will return to levels similar to those from 3 years ago. So what's the major assumption there? Well, that the boll weevil infestations are solely to blame for the decrease in cotton production. Notice cotton production is very clearly listed here in the conclusion. So if there is another cause for the drop in cotton production besides the boll weevils, then all of a sudden what happens? Well, this conclusion here that Eradicon is going to make things better, or at least get things back to where they were before, becomes weakened. So in terms of more specific assumptions, not that you actually have to come up with that as long as you get the general idea of the gap in the argument, but here are some more specific ones are that cotton crops aren't valuable to some other vulnerable to some other pest. There is no other factor that can affect cotton production. This is very similar to what I just said as the major assumption. Maybe a little more subtly, and this is typically what the test writers go for, not the obvious ones, but the more subtle one would be boll weevils will not develop some immunity to Eradicon, or even Eradicon does not adversely affect somehow the rate of production. Of course, you don't have to actually think on this sneaky or subtle of a level, but by just thinking of the assumption, it's going to make you a lot more prepared for what the right answer is going to be, what it looks like, and you're going to be much more on guard against the answer choice traps that, of course, are waiting in one or two of the answer choices that are wrong. So, is that the case? Were you tricked and trapped by some of these answer choices? Well, let's take a look here at A. Eradicon has been proven to repel boll weevils in a laboratory setting. Notice that this is simply consistent with what is already mentioned in one of the premises. It's not something that actually weakens the conclusion. So out with A. B. Farmers in the region have a history of spraying chemicals in order to protect their crops. This shows that farmers will be likely to adopt Eradicon. So if Eradicon is effective, as it seems to be here, then that's a good thing. Very well, the cotton production will return to similar levels. So if anything, this is kind of strengthening or lending support. We need weaken. And it's important to note also that in weaken question types, oftentimes one of the answer choices will definitely be relevant to the conclusion, but it will do the opposite of weaken. It will strengthen or support. C. Most boll weevil infestations happen in the early spring when cotton plants are highly vulnerable. We know that boll weevil infestations have happened. We know that they've negatively affected cotton production, and so C is just kind of reiterating this and giving us more specific details, but it doesn't address this assumption that there's something else going on that could possibly be affecting cotton production, or that there's maybe something off about Eradicon. So let's get rid of C, and we're down to two answers. Both of them are pretty close. They're tricky. So I'm guessing that you chose one of these answer choices. Now, if you chose A through C, pause the video again and actually take a look at D and E, because obviously one of them is the right answer because there are only ones left, and see which one you think it is, and then give yourself a justification. Why do you think it's correct? What about that answer choice is right? And just as importantly, the other answer choice, what about it is wrong? And once you've done that, then we will go through and find out which one is the answer. Okay, I assume you've paused the video for that final lap. Let's start with answer choice E. Farmers need to spray Eradicon on their field once every few days for it to be effective. Now, if this is the case, it seems like, well, what if farmers don't spray Eradicon every few days? Isn't that sort of a high maintenance thing? You always have to spray it on there, so maybe they're going to forget. Well, sounds pretty reasonable to me, so let's circle that answer. But wait a second. I'm adding information. I'm making assumptions about farmers and their work ethic, that spraying more than, or at least once every few days is onerous or burdensome. And that's an assumption that I'm bringing in based on the answer choice. And so you can make an answer choice work by bringing in extra information, the way I just did. And that's what often happens in the wrong answer. They get you that way. So don't say sort of or could have be if I assume this. If you start using those words in your thought processes, be on guard against them, you're likely constructing an argument to make an answer choice work. And that's dangerous. Let's look at D. When used for more than a week, Eradicon begins to leach the ground of nitrates. I know that part right there, leach the ground of nitrates. That doesn't even sound good. What exactly is leaching and nitrates? What are those? And so it's easy to want to just get rid of D. And then, of course, go to E, and it's pretty easy to read and construct your argument. Then you come up with something that's not even in the answer choice itself, and next thing you know, you get it wrong. So leach the ground of nitrates. Assume that nitrates are what the answer choice says, without which cotton plants cannot adequately grow. That's what we really need to know, that by spraying Eradicon, suddenly poor cotton plants can't grow anymore because the Eradicon killed all the nutrients that they depend on. Oh, that would definitely affect what? Cotton production, going back to the conclusion. Always remember the specific conclusion, and therefore D is our answer. Okay, let's recap. What I have here is read and simplify argument. And this is important. Read the argument and simplify it as well. Think of it in your own terms. You can say, okay, there's this boll weevil infestation, and it's happened for the last 3 years, so farmers are going to start using this chemical. The reason I do that is it simplifies the barrage of information, and it makes it easier to think about the conclusion and, of course, the unstated assumptions. And that's, of course, the next step. Think of the major assumption. Just that one major assumption. Don't sit there all day coming up with 4 or 5. That's not the point. The point is for you to get started thinking of some holes in the argument so you can better identify the correct answer. And of course, you want to make sure that you kind of anticipate the answer after you've come up with the major assumption, and then go through every answer choice, not spending too much time on any one answer. Now, I don't think number 4 applied too much to this question because it's not as hard as some of the other paragraph arguments, but sometimes you'll see an answer choice that seems to work. For instance, answer choice E, let's say it had been answer choice A or B. Don't think, oh, that works pretty well. Let's just circle that and move on. Make sure to go through each one. And then in the end, you'll realize that there's usually 2 of them that both kind of seem to work. And that's when you want to apply kind of that analytical muscle that we used earlier. One way, of course, is to make sure that the answer choice directly attacks the assumption, it addresses information in the conclusion, and that you're not adding this extra information. Well, if farmers are lazy and then they don't spray Eradicon every day, it's not going to work. That, of course, wasn't mentioned. That's us making this inferential jump and bringing our own assumptions into the question, something we should always avoid doing.
Okay, in this video, we're going to look at strengthening the question. And a strengthened question can always be identified by the words in the question. Which of the following, if true, would most strengthen, would most lend support? There's a few other variations on it, but essentially strengthen. Now, you don't have to read this first necessarily. Some people, some tutors say, hey, it's a good idea, read that first, then go back to the paragraph. I don't think either way matters. Try out both. Read this first, then read the paragraph. See which works better for you. But I found that most students, as long as they know how to take apart the paragraph, do much better reading the paragraph first. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. So we have here graduates. 80% of graduates from Zenith, from ZU, have been able to secure employment with the first 6 weeks of graduation. Wow, that's a great college, great university. So we've identified our first premise. Percent of students from ZU employed. Now, there really isn't another premise. There's simply the conclusion. The conclusion is this. Well, if you're an engineering student, you should choose Zenith U, especially if you want to be employed upon graduating. So they say, look at this. Wow, 80% of people get a job from ZU. So, hey, engineering person, go to ZU. So, should if they want to get a job after graduating. Now, there are many holes here. Many holes. Many gaps. One of the gaps is, well, wait a second. How can we say engineering student equals normal student? Another possible gap could be, well, wait a second. This is from 2005 to 2009. And now they're saying if you're an engineering student, go there because when you're going to graduate, things are going to be great. That's 4 years later. So we can see that the 2 holes would be number 1 and number 2, economy changes. What we're doing here is anticipating. By identifying the hole, we're anticipating what the answer choice is going to look like. Now, you're going to become better and better at anticipating or finding the hole, anticipating what the answer is. At the same time, don't just sit here all day and go, what else could I think of? It's fine just to say, oh, well, they're saying that engineering students are the same as students, and therefore that's a problem. And even if the correct answer isn't actually apply to that, you can always come back, look at the conclusion, and see if you can think of another reason, such as, oh, the economy changes. The thing, though, is in a strengthened question, you want to plug up the hole. Therefore, the correct answer is going to say that engineering students are exactly the same as other students who graduate from ZU, or engineering students are even more likely than other students graduating from ZU to get a job after graduating. So, that said, let's go down here to the answer choices. A, the economy has been doing well, though analysts forecast that there will be a recession that could last for as long as 5 years. Now, if you noticed a second ago, I said we want to plug up the hole. We want to strengthen the argument. So if we were dealing with the economy, we want to say, hey, the economy is going to be the same 4 years from now when an engineering student graduates, or 5 years from now. Here, though, with A, it's actually saying it's not going to be the same. And so instead of strengthening it, it's going to weaken the argument. And these are common mistakes because we see that, aha, A is doing something. It's working against the argument, yay, and we circle it forgetting that we're dealing with a strengthening question. Same on weakening questions. You have something that strengthens the prompt or the paragraph, and you choose it. So be careful to note the difference. B, since 2005, the number of jobs for engineers has not significantly decreased. Okay, well, maybe in 2009 or in 2005 things weren't going well for engineers. In 2009 they're still not going well, or maybe they were going really well. Now they're still going really well because it's not decreased the number of jobs. But that doesn't answer our question. That doesn't help us plug in the gap. Remember, the gap goes back to comparing engineering students to all students at ZU and thinking the economy is going to be the same. Of course, the correct answer is going to plug up only one of those holes because there's only one correct answer. C, many students who were not able to secure employment within 6 weeks often found jobs soon after. Again, this is irrelevant because we're dealing with engineering students who want to go to ZU or who are told to go to ZU if they want a job. D, compared to all other degrees conferred by ZU, engineering degrees were the most likely to result in employment within 6 weeks. Aha! That's exactly what we wanted. Remember, that was a question. Well, wait a second. You can't say that ZU or engineering students are the same as other students at ZU, or engineering degrees are the same as other degrees. And here it's saying, well, they're not, they're even better. So it even makes it even more likely that if you're an engineering student, you go to ZU, you will have a job upon graduating. So D strengthens it, and that's our answer. Then there's E. Some who earned a humanities degree were not employed 6 months after graduating from ZU. You can see this is a relevant humanities degree. We don't care for this paragraph. And again, the answer is D.
In this video, we're going to be dealing with the assumption question in the paragraph argument question. Now, we've already been doing a lot of this in the weakening and the strengthening videos. We've been identifying the assumption. And based on that assumption, we can either weaken or strengthen the conclusion. So much of what we're doing here in the assumption question, we've already done. In fact, we're doing a little bit less because we don't have to make the extra, oh, let's attack the assumption now. All we have to do is identify the assumption. However, it's not always that straightforward, and there are some tricks, as you'll see here in a moment. But first off, let's revisit the question that we've been using for the strengthening and weakening lesson modules. And it's the good old boll weevil and the eradicon. Now, we identified the assumption is that the boll weevil is the primary cause in the drop in cotton production. Okay. Now, this may actually be an answer choice in the assumption question. It's actually not going to be the answer choice here in a moment, but it's important that we identify the assumptions so that we start thinking about the assumptions in general. But there are a few of them, and what the correct answer is going to be one of the assumptions. What the almost correct answer, but not really, is going to be slightly irrelevant and slightly not something that actually holds the argument together. And what we're going to learn in this video is a way to determine the almost kind of seems like the right answer to the actual assumption or the right answer. But first off, let's have a look at 5 answer choices. A lot of these are going to be familiar since we went through them in the strengthening and weakening videos. For instance, answer choice A is a usual suspect. What you may also notice, and if you have a very good memory or have just watched the weakening video, the answer D here, eradicon leaches the ground of nitrates, is, boom, part of this video. Why? Well, oftentimes in assumption questions, the test writers know that people are drawn to answer choices that are relevant to the prompt. And sometimes students simply don't read the question and race to the answer choices and forget that they're dealing with an assumption, not a weakener. So there's answer choice D for you. Both answer choice in A and C, as we learned in the other videos, simply restate one of the premises. Now, wrong answer choices that are usually clearly off the mark will do that, restate a premise, or they will be completely out of scope and irrelevant to the conclusion. Then there will be a few others. One of them will be the answer. Often one of them will be a weakener to pull you in again because it's relevant to what's going on, but it's not an actual assumption. In fact, it's very close to the opposite because we're not, with the assumption, we're describing the assumption itself. We're not weakening or attacking in it. And then finally, we're going to be dealing with an answer choice that's very close. And on that very close answer choice, and maybe let's say you're astute and you notice that it's a weaken in one of the answer choices, on the remaining two, though, it's really difficult sometimes to tell which one is really an assumption that the conclusion rests on. Therefore, we are going to learn a powerful technique called negating the assumption. And this technique will help you identify which one of those remaining two answer choices is the correct one. So let's come back to B and E in a moment. But first off, let's talk about negating an assumption. Now, first, we have to remember that the conclusion, the validity of that conclusion, is based on these unstated assumptions. They're not mentioned in the prompt itself. But if these assumptions are not valid, then the conclusion completely falls apart. That's something we did in the weaken question. We found an answer choice that cast doubt on one of these assumptions and therefore cast doubt on the conclusion. But this is actually going to give us an important technique here. Knowing that if assumption is not valid, that the conclusion falls apart, allows us to actually determine whether or not an answer choice is an assumption. Because if we attack an answer choice and say, okay, let's come up with the opposite of this. If we come up with the opposite and the conclusion is completely unfazed, unblemished, is not hurt in any way, then we know that, wait a second, we just did the opposite of this answer choice, which is perhaps the assumption, and nothing happened to the conclusion. So if something is an actual assumption and we attack that assumption and say the opposite of that assumption, then the conclusion should fall apart. If it doesn't fall apart, if it's unscathed, then we know we're not dealing with an assumption. And that's called negating an assumption. You add a no or not to one of those two remaining answer choices. Therefore, you're coming up with the opposite of that assumption. And if the argument still holds together after you've added that no or not, then that's not an assumption. On the other hand, if you add that no or not and then the conclusion completely falls apart, then there you got it. That is your assumption, the assumption that holds the argument together. Because again, we're not dealing with the assumption itself, we're dealing with the opposite, the no or not of that assumption. Yes, I know, a little bit vague. And so what we're going to do is have a little mini example here, not an actual question type, obviously. Jason studied 3 hours for the test. Therefore, Jason will pass the test. Will he? So, let's see. We have answer choice A. Is this an assumption upon which this conclusion, Jason will pass the test, is based? So we're going to add a no or not somewhere in answer choice A. Obviously, no Jason has studied for previous tests is absurd. So where's a natural place to put it? Jason has not studied for previous tests. So we've negated that answer choice. If it is an assumption, if it is the assumption we are looking for, then this conclusion should fall apart. Well, the fact that Jason has not studied for previous tests, does that mean 100% he will not pass this test? No, it could go either way. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. Therefore, A is not an assumption upon which this conclusion rests. Let's take a look at B. 3 hours of studying is sufficient preparation for the test. Where's a good place to add that no or that not? 3 hours of studying is not sufficient preparation for the test. That's a good place. What happens? Well, it says he studied 3 hours, therefore he'll pass the test. If it turns out 3 hours is not enough time, then he will not pass the test. So it's not sufficient preparation. He will not pass the test. Therefore, the conclusion will fall apart. Jason will not. Sorry, poor Jason, you will not pass the test. That is how negating the conclusion works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring back those two answer choices, getting a little bit ahead of myself there actually, but the ones we had earlier, I'm just going to put them in A and B format, and you'll see here I already negated the assumption, but let me go back for a second. A, boll weevils will not develop an immunity to Eradicon. It's very easy to negate an assumption or an answer choice that already has no or not in it. Simply get rid of no or not. So, boll weevils will develop an immunity to Eradicon. If this results in the conclusion falling apart, then it is an assumption. Remember, the conclusion is that farmers will use Eradicon, boll weevils go away, and cotton production will be back to normal. But wait a second. I've negated answer choice A, and it says boll weevils are going to develop an immunity to Radicon. It's going to do nothing. They're going to keep infesting. There they come. Watch out for the cotton crops. So you can see, therefore, that this conclusion, this optimism on the part of the agricultural board completely falls apart. Therefore, because we said the opposite of A and the argument completely falls apart, A, going back to the without the not on there, boll weevils will not develop an immunity to Radicon, is an assumption. So again, by negating it, if we weaken it or just have the argument fall apart, then that is an assumption upon which the argument rests. Therefore, A is our answer. What about B, though? B was the other one, going back to the original one. It was answer choice E, but here we're just doing A and B. B, a Radicon is the only chemical available on the market to fight boll weevils. Where can we add the no or not? Well, Radicon is not the only chemical available on the market to fight boll weevils. There are other chemicals. Okay, you can have Supercon. Therefore, because there's Supercon, does that mean the Radicon won't work and cotton production will not return to normal levels? No, maybe, maybe not. And therefore, because everything is fine after we negate answer choice B, we know that B in its original, without the not there, is not an assumption upon which the argument rests. And again, the answer was A, because only when we negated this assumption did the conclusion fall apart.
In this video, we're going to talk about wrong answer choices. Thus far, we've talked about plugging up the gap, noticing the holes in the logic that tries to tie the premise to the conclusion, and then seeing how that hole is recast in different types of questions, such as weaken, strengthen, assumption, evaluate, etc. Here, though, we're simply going to take a weakening question, so it's business as usual now, but we're really going to focus on the answer choices. What makes answer choices incorrect? Now, on the GRE, on the reading comp, and by extension on these paragraph arguments, the wrong answers tend to fall into typical buckets. In fact, they're pretty predictable what the outline is going to look like, the outline of these answers. So let's take a look here first at our paragraph. It says, in August, the Williamstown main city parking garage was completely full every single day of the month. So remember, I drew out little things here for the premise. In August, parking lot full. Okay. Again, once you get more adept at these, you can do this mentally in your head. That is, paraphrase the paragraph. The next sentence. This phenomenon indicates that the main city parking garage in Williamstown is a popular place for parking. Fair enough. Popular place for parking. These are premises. Doesn't really add to what we have here, so I'm not going to write anything down. But here's the conclusion, the big part. Therefore, Williamstown parking garage will be full every day of the month for September. So, because it's full in August, therefore full in September. Now there's a big assumption here. There's a major hole. And that is what holds true for August holds true for September. It can be very different months. August tends to be the end of summer, people on vacation. September, people are back at schools. A lot of very big hole. And I think this question is probably a little bit easier than anything you see on the GRE. Or maybe there'll be one paragraph argument question that's this easy. But again, the whole point here is to show you how the wrong answers work. So again, big assumption, big hole. August and September are two similar things. So we go to the answer choices. Question is, cast the most doubt. We have a weakener here. Weaken the conclusion. And again, if the conclusion is September is also going to be full every day, we want to show something that, hey, September is not going to be that popular a month. People aren't going to be there parking. And so therefore the lot will not be full. So let's start with A. Capeville, a neighboring city, has only one parking garage, though it was not filled every day of the month. So we're dealing here with a different city. Who cares if it's neighboring? Notice as well that it says, oh, it has only one parking garage, and it wasn't filled every day of the month. And so you may think, oh, well, it shows that Capeville isn't a very popular place to be, and maybe next month no one's going to come over here to Williamstown. However, wait a second. Capeville could be a completely different city. Capeville could be a boring industrial city that's next to the nice beach town of Williamstown. We don't know. It could be all of these things. What it is not is relevant. It is not relevant to the conclusion. Capeville is irrelevant. And so this is one of the most common types of wrong answers. Sometimes I also use the word out of scope, meaning that there is a scope of the argument, things that are relevant, and then there are those things that are irrelevant, which are out of scope. So those are the two terms. But for here, I will use irrelevant. B, in July, the Williamstown parking garage was full every day of the month. Notice this is July. What is that going to tell us about September? Nothing. And so again, irrelevant. Let's get rid of both of those guys. Let's look at C. Williamstown is a popular beach town, and tourists across the nation flock to its beaches from June to August, but the city becomes virtually empty come September. Now, you can already see, oh, Chris is, you've stolen your thunder because I can see it says answer here. But ignore that for a second. Why is this the answer? Well, it's trying to tell us something about September, and again, how September differs from August. And now we know it's relevant. And how does it differ? Well, it differs in a very relevant way. And it differs in terms of people coming there to park. Tourists across the country come to its beaches. And then what happens in September? Virtually empty. Therefore, saying, oh yeah, September the parking lot's going to be full as well, is incorrect. And again, we're casting doubt, so C is the perfect answer. Now let's look at some other wrong answer types that are a little trickier than the irrelevant ones, A and B. D, this coming September, the Williamstown City Council is inaugurating the first annual September Rock Festival, which will feature performances throughout the month by popular musicians. And so this is clearly doing something. What is it doing? It's showing us that September is going to keep being popular. People are still going to flock to Williamstown. Yay! But don't circle it, because we're not looking for something that strengthens the conclusion that September the parking lot's probably going to be filled. We're looking for something that weakens it. So watch out. And this falls into the opposite. It does the opposite of what we're doing. So if it's a strengthened question, it weakens. In this case, it's a weakened question, it strengthens. Finally, we have E. The Grand Hotel, a popular hotel in Williamstown, expects to have a full garage the entire month of September. Now, I've classified this one as a seems to do something, and I think it's the trickiest one. Usually when you get adept at these, you can narrow them down to two answer choices. And instead of making it just a 50-50, it's good to notice that, hey, just because one of the answer choices looks like it's doing something, it's definitely pertinent or relevant to the argument, doesn't necessarily mean it's the answer. And so here with the Grand Hotel, what is it telling us? Well, it's a popular hotel. And in September, it says, hey, yeah, our parking lot's going to be filled. So it's in the right city. But wait a second. A parking lot, general parking lot, and a hotel parking lot are two very different things. Maybe Williamstown, or rather the Grand Hotel, the parking lot is filled every day of the year. We don't know. But just because what's true for a hotel parking lot doesn't mean it's true for another parking lot. And therefore, this does not help us out at all. And the answer is C.